Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my standard review of the Sony FE 90mm F2.8 macro OSS lens. Now, this is a lens that I personally, or the kind of lens that I really highly value, and I think that that's best typified by the fact that the lens that has stayed in my kit longer than any other, I've owned it for a good decade, is the Canon 100mm F2.8 LIS macro lens. The Sony is a very similar type lens. It's a stabilized macro lens that, because it is so well executed as a package, it's not just a good macro lens, it's a great general purpose lens as well. And if you're looking for a prime around this focal length, it's well worth considering, even if macro isn't necessarily a priority for you, because it does so many other things competently and just also happens to be a fantastic macro lens to boot. I find that in many cases that there are macro lenses that really are specialist tools. Either they have very slow autofocus or no autofocus at all, no stabilization, and so they're really designed to be used slowly and deliberately on a tripod, which is great if all you want to do is macro. But if you want to have versatility, or even if you like to do your macro often on the fly, you're hiking or whatever, well then a lens like this makes so much more sense. Now, another aspect of this lens is that I'm filming on it at the moment. You can get a sense of the footage that it can produce. And during the time that I've had a loaner of it, I've used it a lot. It's a great focal length and it also produces really beautiful footage that's detailed, has great contrast, and a great dimensional look to it that I really like. Now, if you want even more information about this lens, I recommend that you take a look at the definitive review. We break things down in great detail, do a lot of image quality breakdown, and you'll get more information if you're seriously considering buying it by watching that. However, if you want my quick overview, standard review, you're in the right spot. So first of all, let's talk about the build and handling. This is a lens that really checks most of the boxes for me and has one killer app that we'll get to in just a second. In terms of the basics, this lens comes in the zone. It was released in 2017, first half of the year. And so it was after the point where Sony was really emphasizing its Zeiss partnership and a lot of Zeiss badging that we saw on some early lenses. And they were transitioning towards their own, G Master series and the G look of lenses. And so it's somewhere a little bit between those two things. And so it does have a focus hold button on the side. It does have the standard switches like we're accustomed to finding. It doesn't have a manual aperture ring on it, however. And so that's one thing that we will see in most of the GM lenses and some of the G lenses that come a little bit later on that's missing here. What it does have is weather sealing, though like many Sony lenses, the gasket at the rear mount is so tiny that frankly, I cannot tell you it is there by either a visual or a tactile inspection. I have to trust Sony that it exists because you really can't see it. But they say it's there, so we'll take their word for it on this point. It is an internally focusing lens, so it doesn't change length at all. It does come with a fairly standard, boring lens hood, and nothing really spectacular. The one critique that I've got here in terms of the specifications is that it has a 62mm front filter thread, which is a really uncommon one, and so you're probably not going to have an opportunity to share it across a lot of other lenses, and there's a good chance that you don't have a lot of 62mm filters in your kit already. The lens is a fairly standard for this class length, and the weight is a moderate, again, compares very favorably to other lenses in this class. It's going to be a fairly easy lens to accommodate. It's not really designed with a tripod collar in mind, but I haven't noted any need for a tripod collar myself. It's light enough and it's distributed well enough that I don't find my camera or my tripod pulling down at all if I'm using it there. The inclusion of the image stabilizer does make it really useful for doing handheld macro, something I do a lot of, because a lot of times I'm not doing macro so much where I'm just trying to set all up for it. I tend to do a lot of macro out in nature, which means that I've got to get to it. And so thus there's not a lot of setup involved. And if you learn the right technique and utilize that image stabilizer, you can really get some great handheld macro results like some of these. Now, the killer app that I mentioned is that a lot of times the liability for an autofocusing macro lens, and so autofocus is really useful if you want to do general purpose things, portraits, general purpose work with it. But a lot of times if you want to do macro, the depth of field is so tiny at macro distances that often manual focus gives you a little bit more precision over where focus is going to be at. Problem being is that most autofocus lenses are not great at manually focusing, and that's probably doubly true on the focus by wire systems that we typically see in mirrorless lenses and their stepping motors. In this case, however, Sony has employed a really intelligent clutch mechanism to where you can either have the clutch mechanism forward in autofocus mode, or you can pull the whole focus ring assembly and clutch it down. And what that does is it switches you into a fully engaged mechanical focus ring, a true manual focus experience. Hard stops at minimum and infinity, perfect damping and smoothness, and so at best any of the autofocusing macro lenses that I've used before, and rivals just about any of the true manual focus ones in terms of its performance. I really think that Sony nailed this design, and at first I was a little thrown by it because I haven't seen a lot of clutch mechanisms. It's been a long time ago. I reviewed some Tokina lenses back in the day that employed something like that, and I found it clunky for that application. In this application, however, Sony nailed it, and it's great to have both of those applications. So in the field, I love this design. The lens also has a focus limiter on the side, as well as an on-off button for the OSS. The focus limiter is really useful to help you to get the maximum out of your focus speed by either eliminating the macro range or staying specifically in the macro range if that's what you want to do. Now, on the note of the focus here, we have got Sony's DD-SSM focus system, and I've been impressed in every application. Good focus speed, very quiet in operation, and very good precision. All of that is true here as well. For example, if we take a look at video focus pulls, this is something that, say, my Canon lens, not so good at. But we can see that on the Sony lens, focus pulls are smooth, quiet, and it just nails it without any hunting. Let's take a look. A very nice performance there, and in real world results, I really liked what I've used. As I've noted, I've actually used this lens in my loaner period. I've used it for a lot of video segments because I love the look of the footage. It focuses reliably without, any kind of jitteriness on my face for these stable sections. And I just think it does a great job. So overall, also when it came to IAF, I got very precise results. Tracking was right on. And as you can see from these portrait shots, I got, one after another in a variety of situations, even putting things in the foreground and, playing around with depth of field. I got really focused results, very sharp, and, just a great end product. Nothing to complain about when it comes to autofocus overall. It did a great job during my test period. So let's talk about the image quality. I did a lot of comparisons, and of course, if you want to see those, take a look at the definitive review. But I compared it a lot to the Canon, and what I found is that wide open, the Sony, I would say, is a little bit better. And here's the reason why. It's a little bit sharper in the center of the frame, in the mid frame. There's some give and take along the edges in terms of which lens is stronger. But one thing that the Canon has that the Sony doesn't is that the Canon does struggle some with a bit of lateral chromatic aberrations. And so that tends to show up as a little bit of bleeding sometimes in some textures. It also has a little bit more longitudinal chromatic aberration than what the Sony. So the Sony's better correction of aberration gives it an edge in micro contrast, and also just the crispness of the textures in their rendering without any kind of bleeding along the edges. And so a very strong performance, there. As you stop the lens down, of course, it gets sharper still. And, at landscape apertures, it delivers very sharp, very highly detailed results. Just note that with a longer lens like this, even f8 may not be a deep enough depth of field, depending upon, how flat your plane of focus is in a landscape type image. But, you know, at the same time, that's going to be true of any kind of lens with a little bit longer focal length like this. Now, when we discuss the bokeh, I think that, first of all, overall, I think that the combination of sharpness and softness of the bokeh is fantastic here. There's one exception to that rule, and that is that if you're at very close focus distances and you have circular, bright circular highlights wide open, you actually don't get a fully circular shape. And it behaves a little bit like what did the Zeiss Batis 40mm F2 close focus lens, in that at close focus distances, the aperture automatically closes down enough to where you start to see the shape of the aperture blades. I think around f5.6, somewhere in that range is what I'm guessing it's at. And so byproduct of that is that you don't really get a perfectly circular shape even with the aperture wide open, which typically the aperture blades are completely retracted and you don't see any aperture shape at all. It's very round. That's not really true here. So ironically, you're going to get better close focus results if you stop down to f4. Then you get better circular shapes because you're controlling the aperture rather than the camera at that point. And so I just found that that gave me more reliable results up close. I did note a little bit of busyness in some of those bright highlights, not so much onion bokeh, just some patterning in there. And so that's something you might, you know, just kind of use the lens to its advantages. Beyond that, however, both foreground and background bokeh are very, very beautifully rendered. And, you know, for example, with portraits, because I recognize that, I really enjoyed defocusing things and using them to frame as a part of portraits, because I really found that the results were quite stunning. And so overall, I really like what we've got here. Great contrast, very, very beautifully color saturation, and images just had a really special quality to them. I love them. And so this is a lens that I really like. So in conclusion, I think where this lens really sets the bar high is in the versatility. It does a lot of things well. It's a great autofocus lens. It is also a great manual focus lens, and that's something that I can rarely say. And so that makes it really good for video work because you can actually clutch back into true manual focus and do smooth focus pulls, all of that. But it does quite a good job for autofocus and autofocus focus pulls if that is your preferred way of handling things. So it's a really great video lens. It's a great general purpose, you know, portrait lens, you know, general purpose lens, and of course a great macro lens. And so this is a kind of lens that I will often point people towards as maybe their third lens in their kit. You know, they've got a wider angle or standard zoom, you know, maybe they've got a telephoto zoom, and they're looking for a prime, you know, maybe even for dedicated portraits. This is a great option. It does a lot of things really well. It is a little bit on the pricey side. It's going to cost you over $1,000, around the $1,100 or so range. And so it is a little bit more expensive than, say, what the Canon equivalent is. At the same time, I think it's probably a little bit better a lens overall. It does things that my Canon lens does not necessarily do well. And so I think that that added versatility, and of course the fact you really don't have a lot of autofocus macro options on Sony. And in this case, you've got a very, very good option. And so if you can save a little bit longer and your budget goes as far as this lens, it is well worth investing in. If you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review with a lot of details, a lot of images there. Also links to the image gallery if you want to look at more photos and see if you like the look of images. There's also buying links in the description, as well as linkage to follow me on social media, to become a patron, or to sign up for my newsletter. And if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.